Well, I guess it's been a couple of weeks since we were last in 2 Kings, and I thought I had this all ready to go, but obviously I am mistaken. Yeah, go ahead and take care of that. We'll be there with you in a minute. Unbelievable. Okay, there we go. All right, I think I'm ready. When we last dove into 2 Kings, we finished up with chapter 10 of 2 Kings. And if we remember over in chapter 9, when we were studying chapter 9, that Ahaziah, the king Ahaziah, had been killed. And then after that, all of Ahab's family had been killed, and everybody within that. And then Athaliah, who was the mother of Ahaziah, we'll pick up here in 11. And you gotta follow this chapter kind of close in order to pick up on the importance of God's promises within this chapter, because we had the Mosaic promise, and we had and then we have Abraham's promises, and then we had God's promise that He would always preserve, that the Messiah would come from David's lineage. But starting in verse 1, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, remember he was killed in chapter 9, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram and sister of Ahaziah, the one who was killed, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered, because that was what Athaliah wanted to happen, wanted all of them dead. And so she put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah. So he was not killed. And he remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled the land. So the queen, Mother Queen, was ruling the land. And in the 7th year, Jehoiada, I hope we don't have a test when we get to heaven of how to pronounce all these names. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent for the commanders of units of 100, the Carites and the guards, and had them brought to him at the temple of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them, and he put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. And then he showed them the king's son, which was Ahaziah, or Joash, excuse me. Then he showed them the king's son. He commanded them, saying, "This is what you are to do. You who are in the three companies that are going on duty on the Sabbath, a third of you guarding the royal palace, a third of you at the Sur gate, and a third at the gate behind the guard, who take turns guarding the temple. And you who are in the other two companies that normally go off Sabbath duty are all to guard the temple for the king. Station yourselves around the king, each of you, with a weapon in hand. And anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death." Yes. Oh, 2 Kings 11. Yes. 2 Kings 11. That's okay. So we're in 2 Kings 11, verse 9. The commanders of units of 100 did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath, and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. Then he gave the commanders the spears and shields that had belonged to King David, and that were in the temple of the Lord. The guards, each with a weapon in hand, stationed themselves around the king, near the altar and the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. So he's now 7 years old, and he's been in seclusion with the nurse or the person taking care of him for all this time. Jehoiada gets with the group and says, "This is the king. This is Ahaziah's son. He's the rightful heir to the throne." And so all the guards are in agreement with this. And he brought him out, put the crown on him, and he presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. And so they anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." When Athaliah heard the noise made by the guards and the people, she went to the people at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king, standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her robes and called out, "Treason, treason!" Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders of units of 100 who were in charge of the troops, "Bring her out between the ranks, and put the sword into anyone who follows her." For the priest had said she must not be put to death in the temple of the Lord. So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses enter the palace grounds, and there she was put to death. Jehoiada then made a covenant with the Lord and the king and the people that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. All the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols to pieces and killed Mattan the priest of Baal in front of the altars. Then Jehoiada the priest posted guards at the temple of the Lord, and he took with him the commanders of hundreds, the Karites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and together they brought the king down from the temple of the Lord and went into the palace, entering by way of the gates of the guards. The king then took his place on the royal throne. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm, because Athaliah had been slain with the sword at the palace. Joash was 7 years old when he began his reign. So Athaliah was upset because her husband was killed. She was going to kill every one of the family, and but a unsuspecting individual, you could say, because this Jehoshaphat took Joash and stole him away. And so this was, I guess it would make Joash's aunt was the one who stole him and took him away and made sure that he was safe. So and then there in 15, in 17, Jehoiada made a covenant with God, the king and the people, and then the queen mother, Athaliah, was slain. And so spiritual reforms, where they began to go back to what God had wanted them to do. And then in verse 12, in the 7th year of Jehu, Joash became the king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years. His mother's name was Zibiah. She was from Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So he was only 7 years when he took the became king, but the priest, Jehoiada, was more or less his mentor in instructing him. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Joseph said to the priests, "Collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord. The money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. And let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers. Then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple." But by the 23rd year, remember he served 40 years, it said, but by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priests still had not repaired the temple. Therefore King Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priests and asked them, "Why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from your treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple." The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money from the people and that they would not repair the temple themselves. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. He placed it beside the altar on the right side as one enters the temple of the Lord. The priest who guarded the entrance put into the chest all the money that was brought to the temple of the Lord. And whenever they saw that there was a large amount of money in the chest, the royal secretary and the high priest came, counted the money that had been brought into the temple of the Lord, and put it into bags. And when the amount had been determined, they gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. And with it they paid those who worked on the temple of the Lord, the carpenters and builders, the masons, stone cutters. They purchased timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple of the Lord, and met all the other expenses of restoring the temple. The money brought into the temple was not spent for making silver basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, or any other articles of gold or silver for the temple of the Lord, who used it to repair the temple. They did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. The money from the guilt offerings and sin offerings was not brought into the temple of the Lord, because it belonged to the priest. About this time, Hazael, king of Aram, went up and attacked Gath and captured it. Then he turned to attack Jerusalem. But Joash, the king of Judah, took all the sacred objects dedicated by his predecessors, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah, the kings of Judah, and the gifts he himself had dedicated, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the temple of the Lord and of the royal palace, and he sent them to Hazael, king of Aram, who then withdrew from Jerusalem. So he's more or less taking all the treasures, and he's pretty much bribing them and saying, "Hey, look, don't attack us. We'll give you all of this." As for the other events of the reign of Joash and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Judah? His officials conspired against him and assassinated him at Beth Millo on the road down to Silla. The officials who murdered him were Jozabad, son of Shimeath, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer. He died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, and Amaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. So Joash, he followed the Lord and what he wanted him to do as far as destroying Baal and all the sacrifices that were being done that were not pleasing to God. And the temple had fallen into despair because of everything that had been going on. And Joash, While he was being guided by Jehoiada, he repaired the temple. And Jehoiada lived to be 130 years old. And so, he influenced Joash as far as following God, and Joash encouraged the people to seek God. But as Jehoiada was no longer around to influence Joash began to falter a little bit. And, he had been dramatically rescued by his aunt. Kind of reminds you of when Moses was put in a basket and then rose up to lead the people out of Egypt. But Joash rebelled against God, and then his life ended. But he tried to as I mentioned, he tried to invade this army with treasures without the guidance of Jehoiada being there, and then the Aramean invasion, as we'll find out later, soon overruns Judah. But he was murdered in his own bed, and he was murdered by his own officials, and shown no respect in his burial. It kind of, we have external influence that can happen. Sometimes this happens with new Christians. We are on fire for the Lord. We have a lot of zeal for the Lord, just as Joash did here. But then as we get older, as we go on through life, Satan is always out there trying to bring us down. And the external influences that we have can cause us to forget our first love of God and not seek Him like we initially did with our first love for Him. In chapter 13, in the 23rd year of Joash's son, remember, Joash's son became king. Joash, son of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, became king of Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord by following the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, and he did not turn away from them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he kept them under the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and Ben-Hadad, his son. And then Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram was oppressing Israel. And the Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they escaped from the power of Aram. So the Israelites lived in their own homes as they had before, but they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. They continued in them. Also, the Asherah pole remained standing in Samaria. Nothing had been left of the army of Jehoahaz except 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers, for the king of Aram had destroyed the rest and made them like the dust at threshing time. As for the other events, the reign of Jehoahaz, all he did and his achievements, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Jehoahaz rested with his ancestors and was buried in Samaria, and Jehoash, his son, succeeded him as king. So we've gone through another king here in Israel, Jehoahaz, and now his son Jehoash, king of Israel, takes over. And reading through this, he reigned for 16 years. He also did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. And so he too was passed away, and he rested with his ancestors. And Jeroboam succeeded him on the throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. Remember when we started our study of 2 Kings, Elisha was the prophet that was talking to the kings and dealing with the people. And in verse 15 of chapter 13, or excuse me, verse 14, now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. And Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Elisha said, get a bow and some arrows, and he did so. Take the bow in your hands. And he said to the king of Israel, when he had taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Open the east window, he said, and he opened it. Shoot, Elisha said, and he shot. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram, Elisha declared. You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek. So he's prophesying right here of what's going to happen. And then he said, take the arrows, and the king took them. Elisha told him, strike the ground, and he struck it 3 times and stopped. And the man of God was angry with him, and he said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times. And Elisha died and was buried. Now, the next little bit I find a little fascinating. And it's just a little blurb in the Bible. Elisha died and was buried. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. And when the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. I don't ever remember studying that in the Bible. But Elisha, although he was dead, was still providing life. And you know, I was thinking about that when I was studying this, and you know, I think we look at our loved ones that have passed away. Our loved ones that have passed away still give us life. Whether it's the memories that we have, whether it's, and that's what it all is the memories that they have, but we have their their spirit with us, and they still give us life. In here, it was a physical life where the guy was dead, and he touched Elisha's bones, and he became alive and stood up. But the people that we've loved, and when they pass away, they still give us life. But I thought that was just an interesting deal. You don't hear anything else what happened to this gentleman who became alive again, but it's just a little snippet within the Bible here that talks about Elisha. And then Hazael, the king of Aram, oppressed Israel throughout the reign of Jehoaz. The Lord was gracious to them and had compassion and showed them concern because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to this day, he has been unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. Hazael, king of Aram, died, and Ben-Hadad, his son, succeeded him as king. And then Jehoash, son of Jehoshaphat, recaptured from Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the towns he had taken in battle from his father Jehoaz. And well, I just hit the wrong button. And then we go into chapter 14, and these chapter 14 and 15, we have Amaziah, the king of Judah, and then after Amaziah, the king of Judah, we have Jeroboam the second, king of Israel. And then we have Azariah, the king of Judah, and Zechariah, the king of Israel, and Shallum, the king of Israel, and Menahem, the king of Israel. But all of these kings, as went through here, they were kings for a little bit, but they did not do what the Lord wanted. And so they served a short amount of time, and then they were killed, or they died. And but so there's more kings. This goes over more kings and more distress, and that went on. But in studying through here, Elisha, in life and death, life flowed through Elisha, and day after day, relationship after relationship that we studied early on in about Elisha, that Elisha did what he was commanded to do, and the same God that Elisha worshipped is the same God that we worship. God hasn't changed, and his power hasn't diminished, and he's still just as true and just as powerful as he was for Elisha. I'm sorry?
Were these predecessors, I guess that's what, of David?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, that's where we started there with Joash, and he was the lineage had reduced down to Joash, and after Ahaziah had been killed, and so the lineage of David was down to just that king. Or
Even Solomon didn't do what God.
no, it's kind of like they all start out okay, but just like we as Christians, how challenging is it? We, as I mentioned earlier, our first love, as far as when we become Christians, is strong, but Satan is always trying to tear us down, and he doesn't tear us down in one big way. He just chisels at us a little bit each time until he finds that weak point. And but we've in thinking about the tornadoes that have gone through up in Mississippi, and we see all the damage and everything that gets done by these terrible storms, and sometimes what we see is remaining is a chimney or a stairwell. And I looked at that. We have all these kings that they fought here, they didn't do what God wanted. They destroyed the temple, they restored the temple, they continued their idol worship, but There was always an effort made, but just as a chimney may stand or a stairwell may stand after a storm, God always kept a remnant of believers who he would use to carry on his plan. And although there were many dynasties of these kings that were blown away, God continued, as he promised from the beginning, to preserve the house of David and the promised line through David that the Messiah would come from. So his power, as we see, is unshakable, and his promises are kept throughout the Bible and throughout our lives. You know, lots of times our lives can feel like a furious storm that we're dealing with, and of just events that are going on, and we see political parties grabbing for power, and it just seems like our entire life is just a big storm. But we've got to, and even in our relationships, even in our jobs, or that we try to seek as peace in our life. Everything can just seem to be blown away, and so we've got to put all our faith and in God and what he has for us. As I mentioned before, I think maybe last time or whatever, that God, all we see is right here, and God sees the big plan. And when there's a challenge before us, God is trying to strengthen us. God is trying to prepare us for what he has ahead of us. And we have, and I've mentioned this before, we have the blessing of having the whole Bible. We have the whole story before us. We see all the death and destruction, and we see all the trials and tribulations that the Israelites went through. But God made a promise to Israel. He made a promise to his children that he would always take care of them. All he asked for was to love me. That's all he asked for. Love me, serve me. And that's still all he asks of us today. But as easy as that sounds, how hard we make it. And so I just encourage you as we go through our life, even though this world is shaking and God has a steady hand upon it, everything that happens is because God is allowing it to happen, and we just have to look forward to that day when he comes and takes us away from all of this. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for loving us,